Sustainability School event on social value monetisation, and welcome. This has been a really popular subject. We've had over 250 people booked on this event, so it's clearly a subject that hits the spot for a number of people in terms of the sustainability agenda and the social value agenda, particularly coming through government and public sector organisations. A couple of quick admin issues. Okay, so if you are having any technical difficulties, please do use the chat box. My colleague Rose is on the call and she can help you if you do have any technical problems. And there's a number there if you can dial in. If it's not quite working on your browser, try Google Chrome. That's usually the best platform for this type of webinar. So hopefully that should work for you. We are recording the webinar, so please do use the recording to distribute. It will be up on the school website once we've all finished. Please do give us your feedback. You will get a warning up on the screen towards the end of this morning's event. We rely on people's feedback on these events. How well are we doing? We run over 200 events a year in the supply chain school. We've had to convert everything, obviously, in the COVID world to virtual events, and we're still learning how to do it. So any advice you can give us, any feedback you can give us is really, really valuable. Thank you. Next slide, Rosie, please. I feel like the Prime Minister doing next slide, please. So this is the agenda for the day. I'm Shaun McCarthy. I chair the Supply Chain School, and I'm delighted to stage this event today because we've got some fantastic speakers. Next up is Daniel Fujiwara from Symmetrica Jacobs, who's going to be talking about really sort of thinking about the theory and practice of delivering social value and particularly monetizing it. Then we have a video to show you. Darren Nald, unfortunately, from Chief Procurement Officer from Durham County Council, wasn't available today, but he was happy to record a video interview with myself. So we're going to play you that 20-minute video so you get a public sector perspective. Then we're going to have a bit of a break, and then we're going to ask Louise Townsend to speak from Morgan Sindall about practically on the ground, what does it mean to be delivering social value through supply chains. I guess from my perspective, listening to feedback from our 108 plus partners in the school and our 14,000 member organisations in the school, I would summarise social value as being like the Wild West. It seems that there's a lot of confusion and a lot of different ways of interpreting social value, which is very confusing for purchasers, because if government is saying you need to address social value in your procurement, then how do you do that? How do you compare one supplier's offer from another? How do you compare one model from another? What really is and isn't social value? So I don't think we're going to have all the answers today, but I think what we will have is a really good debate from some people who really understand this in depth, and we can start the discussion about what this means. We'll have a really robust discussion around the issues today, and then look at maybe how we take things forward in the future. So I do hope you enjoy it. Do give us your feedback. I'm going to hand over to Daniel now, who's a real expert in this subject. So Daniel, over to you to run your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Shaun. Good morning, everyone. So I'm Daniel Fujiwara, and as Shaun said, I'm CEO of Symmetrica Jacobs. So we are a specialist consultancy firm looking at quality of life measurement and social value analysis. And last year we were acquired by Jacobs Engineering Group, so hence we are now operating as Symmetrica Jacobs. I also have a teaching position or academic position at the LSE, where we do a lot of the cutting edge research around social value measurement. And it's that research area that I'd like to talk to you today and really set out what valuation means and how we actually value intangible things like improvements in health, reductions in crime, decreases in air pollution, for example. All of those things are important as part of social value measurement. But how do we actually attach a monetary figure to those things? That's what I want to tackle today. I'll take you through a bit of the theory. It's quite an in-depth kind of, touching on technical issues presentation. And then I'll give you 3 or 4 case studies at the end just to see how it's applied in real life. So just as some background, social value measurement is now a core part of UK policy evaluation methodology, but also we can see that globally as well. And there's an emerging consensus now within academia, mainly within kind of the field of economics, but also increasingly other fields like behavioral science, statistics are inputting into this area. There's this consensus around what best practice is, and you can see that reflected now in the HM Treasury Green Book, which is our core manual in the UK for how to measure social value. And the Green Book's recommendations really just reflect the OECD, for example, but also what the UN and the WHO set out. And therefore we can see this similar guidance, really kind of widespread across all of these OECD countries. So the Canadian guidelines, the New Zealand guidelines I've got here, the US guidelines are all very similar now to the OECD and the Green Book. And at the core of all of these guidance manuals is a method known as social cost benefit analysis. And this is really kind of now the best practice and the favored method within government. And we've been fortunate enough to be heavily involved in the development of a lot of this methodology and guidance. And you'll be aware of some of the new Green Book guidance that's coming out soon. We've been contributing as part of that as well. So we've been really working at the coalface of all of this and helping guide policy, as it were, in this particular area. So what is social cost benefit analysis? I mean, the name gives it away, I guess. So it's what we're trying to do is look at the benefits and the costs for the whole of society. And this method was developed about 250 years ago, so it has a huge amount of history. And because of that, a lot of research, especially within economics, which has really allowed us to fine tune the different methods and techniques that sit under the banner of cost benefit analysis. And we saw it really interestingly, actually, in France in the 1700s, there's a bridge that was being built between two towns. And the government decided to move away from thinking about what the financial savings are of building this bridge or what the financial impact to the government is. And in that circumstance, they were looking at increased tax payments from connecting these two towns and really pushing the envelope and starting to think about what are the wider impacts on society. So in addition to any increase in commerce, are there quality of life benefits to the individuals that live in the town because they become connected, for example? Does it give one of the towns more access to particular services? So they really started to think about these wider benefits. At that time, there were no methods available to be able to quantify those things and monetize them fully, but we've seen that develop over time. And so where we are now in terms of social cost benefit analysis is really a 7-step approach. So what we have to do initially is obviously specify what the project is. So, is it a bridge? Is it a new stadium? Is it a public park or a public space, for example? And then we have to think about the groups with standing. So that's just a fancy term for who are the groups or people that are going to be impacted on, or who are the stakeholders. So who are the users of the new park facility, for example? What businesses in the local area will be impacted on? Will it have an impact on the environment? We need to think about all of those different stakeholders. We then need to, as part of that process at the same time, really think about what the outcomes are. So is it more use? Is it that hence then better physical health, better well-being for individuals? Does it increase revenue for local hotels, for example, having this green space? We need to think about all of those different types of impacts. Then we start to get into the tricky area, which is measuring the outcomes. So in a quantitative way, if we're concerned with, for example, improved physical health by giving people access to some green space in a city setting, how do we know that any improvement that we see in health are because of the park and nothing else? They may have been doing lots of other things in their life at the same time. They may have been using another park. So we really want to know in a causal sense, what is the impact of what we're delivering? And that is a very kind of technical statistical question, which we won't get into here, but there are guidelines. There's a guidance manual called the Magenta Book in the government that we use to typically make these judgments and assessments around causal effects. Once we know the outcomes, we then need to monetize all of those impacts. So we need to put a monetary value on everything from employment up to clean air, for example, so that we can digest and compare all of those different impacts in the same way. We then aggregate all of those impacts across all of the individuals that are impacted on and across all of the different types of outcomes. We then aggregate the costs of the intervention. So that's going to be the investment costs or the build costs of doing something, but also any negative effects are also known as costs. So if through the construction phase you are generating more CO2 emissions than business as usual, that is a cost to society that must also be calculated as part of this equation. And then the final bit is kind of aggregating all of that up. So the net social benefits are the benefits minus the costs. If that's positive, if that's greater than zero, there are positive social value for society. Or we can also look at a benefit cost ratio, which is a little bit like a return on investment figure. So you're dividing the benefits by the costs. And this will say for every pound that you're investing in this particular project, how much social value are you generating in monetary terms? And anything over a ratio of 1 is seen as having social value. So let's get into this area of what value actually means. So there's a few points just to be aware of. There's a bit of a misunderstanding we see across the literature around what the word social actually means in social value. What it doesn't mean is a type of impact. And what I mean by that is we shouldn't be thinking about economic, environmental, and then social impacts. And in this case, social might be things like crime, health, and sports activity and that type of thing. So that's not the way we want to think about it. Social is the aggregated impact on all individuals in society, and it doesn't really matter where that impact comes from. So in that sense, a project may have increased CO2 emissions, it may reduce crime in a local area, and it may have benefits for businesses in terms of increased revenues. All of those things are social because ultimately they impact on individuals in society. So the social in social value is all encompassing. We are covering economic, environmental, and wider societal impacts all together. We're not just focusing on one particular area of impact here. And we need to think about four key stakeholder groups: individuals and communities, taxpayers and the government. Are there additional costs or are there cost savings for the government? Businesses, how does it impact on businesses' profit and revenue? And then finally, any impacts on the environment or animal welfare would be the other category. The really key area is to think about two types of values that we can generate through investments in construction, through our supply chain, all of those kind of infrastructure related activities. The first is what are known as primary benefits. They're called primary because they are benefits directly initially to the individuals. Okay, so let's take that example again of building some public realm or some public space within an inner city. That could be green space, it could just be an area where people can relax, congregate, or spend a bit of time, for example. So a bit like a town square or something like that. So there are individual benefits, directly to people that live in that area or visit the area. Okay. And some of those might be financial related. So business owners in that area, there may be impacts on those individuals there. For certain types of projects, there may be an employment effect. So people might be having higher rates, higher salaries, for example. The people that are building that public realm may benefit financially by being employed as part of that project and receiving a salary. The really interesting bit, though, is the box in green, which is the non-financial benefits. Okay, so these are just examples that are things like impacts on crime, air quality, health, biodiversity, cultural heritage, all of these wider effects. So with that public realm, we might be talking about things like connecting communities, reducing loneliness. We could be talking about aesthetic value if it's a very, well-designed area. If there's some green space there and people are exercising, we might be having a value for physical benefits. So all of these non-financial benefits, they're not immediately cashable in any way. They are just benefits to an individual's quality of life. Also, there are going to be spillover benefits, and these are what are called secondary benefits. Okay, so improvements in people's health because they're now using a green space facility may end up in reductions in NHS healthcare costs. So that's an impact directly on HM Treasury, on kind of the financial coffers, as it were. There may also be increased in tax receipts. So if there's more business activity in that area and there are more, restaurants and takeaway places and things like that that pop up, there'll be tax receipts, increased tax revenue for government. So these are spillover benefits for government and businesses as well. So the things that are in the blue box there, I just want to differentiate. They are typically already in financial terms. So there's no monetization. As long as you have the data there, it's actually quite easy to make what these benefits are going to be. What is the reduction in NHS cost savings, for example? What is the increase in tax revenue? Government, or there are sources that will typically be able to, that you can use to estimate that. The really tricky bit is that bit in green, which is these non-financial benefits. And this is where government at the moment, and you can see it within the Green Book, where all of the focus is going, because this is the new stuff that typically hasn't been assessed before. So in this country, we've been very good at looking at the stuff that is in the blue boxes, those financial benefits, whether it's for individuals or businesses and the government, because the data has always been there and prevalent. It's these non-financial benefits that are now starting to drive policy decisions, and we have a huge amount of interest in how we measure those and incorporate them into our assessments. So you can flip through the Green Book. It's not that bad of a read. There are technical elements, but it should make sense with a bit of background information. But on, I think it's page 40 or something like that, there's this graph in there that sets out the different methods that you can use to value these non-financial benefits. So one example is physical health. If we keep going with that example, how do we measure an improvement in someone's physical health? Well, these 3 or 4 methods, the ones I've circled in particular, are now being used by government on lots of major schemes at the moment around construction, supply chain, and infrastructure. Basically, we can ask people how much they value that change in health. What we always do is focus that in terms of how it improves their well-being. Another method that we've got circled here called the well-being method is actually looking at how health improves well-being directly and monetizing that. And I'll get into a bit more detail about how these methods work when I show you the case studies. But there is this go-to table within the Green Book that sets out what methods you should be using. This is the same in the OECD guidance. Just to be aware, there are lots of other methods that have been developed around this that try to put values on these non-market outcomes, but at the moment they're not considered best practice. Just the last bit on kind of the theory and what it all means. What we're trying to do when we value something is to look at how that thing impacts on someone's well-being. So physical health, an improvement in physical health is valuable because ultimately it improves someone's quality of life or their well-being. What I mean by that is, let's say they are able to go back to work or sustain their employment because of their improved physical health. Maybe they don't suffer with back pain so much anymore. They may lose weight and hence have a longer life expectancy. They may be able to go back to doing sports that they enjoy, for example. All of these quality of life benefits is what we're trying to capture. And you can think through that type of process for any type of outcome. I'll give you one more, for example, a reduction in crime. So this is an area that we've seen come in quite commonly into large infrastructure projects where there might be things about redesigning the city, putting in more street lighting, reducing kind of darkness in certain areas in the city and increasing connections between communities. We've estimated that sometimes those things lead to reduction in crime. So how does that impact on our well-being? Well, ultimately, it's things like fear of crime becomes reduced, and that has a very large positive effect on our well-being. But also, those people that would have been victims to crime had we not had that policy in place or that investment in place, they are now avoided that victimization. So again, another very large impact and improvement on their quality of life. So the value of something is really just the amount of money that has the same impact on someone's well-being. So this is the really critical piece. So the improved health impacts on people's well-being through multiple channels, and all we want to know to value it is, okay, that's improved well-being by say 10%. How much money do we need to give to an individual to improve their well-being by 10% as well, in place of that improvement in physical health? Okay, and let's just say that's £2,000. What we can say there is that £2,000 and an improvement in physical health both have the same effect on someone's well-being, so they're equally valuable. And that's how we get to the value of something. So what's really critical to understand here, and this is where a lot of the criticism about valuation and monetization, I think, is really misleading, is we're not trying to commodify things like good health. We're not saying what happens if good health was traded on markets or stuff like that. What we're actually just trying to do is measure the impact of good health on people's well-being and put that onto another scale, onto a monetary scale, so that we can compare that to other things. So it's a little bit like measuring the warmness of a day through degrees Celsius or degrees Fahrenheit. We're just putting it on another scale. So there's nothing intrinsically important about money that we're using here. We're just using it as what's called a numeraire, or a metric or a benchmark against which we're measuring changes in well-being. Okay, so it's not this kind of a capitalist drive to try and commodify and commercialize everything. That's not at all what we want to do. We're just trying to assess the changes in well-being and monetize that. There are methods that don't monetize, and they just say it's led to a 10% improvement in well-being, for example. And that's fine, but the difficulty there is you can't ever compare back to the costs. So how do you ever know if a 10% improvement in well-being is worth £1 million of investment by the government, for example? To do that, you need to monetize and value the well-being changes. And that's why cost-benefit analysis is seen as the main method. In the previous slide, I said there were other methods that have also been developed to quantify and value these types of outcomes. The reason why they are not part of the Green Book and these other guidelines, and hence not best practice at the moment, is because they don't target well-being. They do other things. They look at, for example, cost savings. So one example I've seen is, what's the value of free swimming lessons to a group of children, for example, in a deprived area? So the wrong way to go about that is to try and look at the cost of delivering those swimming lessons and assume that's the value. That's not the value. That's just the cost of delivering something. The value is the benefit or the change in quality of life for those children that participate in those swimming lessons. And this is where the Green Book methodology gets into, but other methods fall short of that. They don't really get to the full well-being change. So just in terms of sub-applications, the first method I will show you, and this is probably the most consistent or the most prominent method that's used at the moment within infrastructure projects, construction, those kind of major schemes run by government, is a method called stated preference. It was one of those things in the table that I showed you earlier on. So this method basically sets out a scenario to individuals in a survey and asks them their willingness to pay if it's a good outcome, or willingness to accept compensation for a bad outcome, to keep their well-being constant. So how much is the maximum you'd be willing to pay, or what is the amount that you'd be willing to accept, for example, in compensation for poorer air quality, such that your well-being is held constant, the same as it was before the air quality started to worsen. So that's why this kind of theme of well-being runs through all of it. So we typically set out what the investment's going to be, what are the outcomes that we expect from that. There's a lot of research that goes into that. And then we'll administer these surveys with large samples in the population. And probably the most prominent one that we've worked on, or the most famous one in the public eye at the moment, is the A303 at Stonehenge. So we worked on this over the past 3 years now. We ran a large stated preference study to look at the wider benefits of removing the A303 from the World Heritage Site and having a tunnel there instead. So the tunnel would start before the World Heritage Site and come out after the perimeter of it. The benefits of it, there are multiple benefits. There are also risks involved in it, but the benefits are effectively reducing noise pollution, reducing air pollution, improving visual amenity, improving the visitor experience of the stones, maintaining the stones because you've removed all of that pollution, vibration and road noise from the stones, reducing rat running in local areas, and also making the World Heritage Site complete again, so people can wander and walk through the whole site rather than having this kind of road intersecting it. So we looked at those benefits in a stated preference study, and we surveyed around 5,000 people from the local area, visitors, but also the wider population, about how much value they place on removing the road and having a tunnel. There's a segment of that population or the sample that wanted to keep the road as it was because they felt there's too much risk in starting to dig under the World Heritage Site and removing the road, for example. There are a bunch of people that wanted to pay to keep the current road as it is. That's their preferred option. But they were outweighed by the value that people place on actually removing it and preserving the stones and having all of those benefits I've just spoken about. So I've just split this into the different areas. But if we look at the economic impacts, these are things like journey time savings, getting people to work quicker from removing this road and having a tunnel. That's worth about close to £800 million over the life course. This is about 50 years of the project that we are looking at. The costs of the tunnel or the scheme, which are building the tunnel, are about 1.7 billion. So those economic impacts on their own are nowhere near the costs of it. So if we're just looking at the economic impacts, we wouldn't undertake this scheme. The wider kind of societal impacts that we looked at, so all of those things about heritage preservation, noise reduction, pollution reduction, were worth a further £1.3 billion to society over 50 years. If you use these Green Book methodologies correctly, you can then add together the social impact values with the economic or business related values. So what we get to is about just over £2 billion of social value, okay? And we can compare that now back to the scheme costs. So under what I call the full assessment, which is all of the benefits added together, there are net social benefits which are worth £363 million over the course of this project. This is a BCR of 1.2. That's just basically around 2 billion divided by 1.7 billion. This says that every pound that you invest in this scheme, you're going to be generating 1.2 billion pounds of social benefits. And we did lots of sensitivity analysis around this. And this is probably our most conservative estimate that we had. So on paper, it suggests that we should go ahead with this scheme. There are then lots of other details and constraints that you need to think about around the capacity for organizations to be able to do this. Can the government afford this scheme? But, just the social value assessment on its own as part of the business case is showing that this scheme would generate social value. And this was a key driver behind the decision last week by the Department for Transport to go ahead with this scheme. Another quite similar scheme that we've worked on, this is more around infrastructure or buildings, is the new proposed Everton FC Stadium at Bramley Moor Dock in Liverpool, which is to be based actually on a on heritage sites. So it doesn't really have any use at the moment, but there are apparently some valuable heritage assets in that dock, but it's all closed off to the public. So we looked at the value of the heritage, and hence that's the value that's going to be lost through this. And then we looked at the value of the stadium in its widest sense possible. So jobs creation, local regeneration, sense of community pride, the public realm, and people using that stadium on all of the public facilities that come with that stadium. We also went as far as looking at potential on pitch for this club in the future for having a stadium, and whether that has a value for local communities, obviously to the supporters of that club. And we found that on net, the stadium generates about £219 million of social wider value. That's on top of about £1 billion of economic value. So altogether, the full social value is just over 1.2 billion. The cost of building a stadium is about 500 to 600 million. So we're getting a really strong BCR here of about two to one for this particular scheme, which is really strong when you assess, compare it to other types of schemes. Finally, just the other types of methods that we look at is the well-being valuation method. So we collect lots of data on people's well-being and all of these other factors about their life, their health, their local area, their employment status, etc. We can use that type of data to try and understand how certain things impact on people's well-being by running statistical models, and valuing that by looking at the equivalent amount of money that we need to give people to have that same impact. And this is some work that we've done on the M60 recently for Highways England. So we looked at around that blue contour, which is where the road is going to be redeveloped. We looked at average levels of noise. We looked at average levels of life satisfaction, which is our well-being metric. We looked at things like journey time variability, average journey times in that area as well. And this allowed us to do quite a lot of quite neat analysis. So we could look at how increases in pollution and noise because of this change in the infrastructure where we're going to have more cars on the road, how all of those negative environmental impacts stack up together. What is the impact on QOL, that's quality of life, and what is the value of that over a 30-year period? So there's a cost of about £850 million in social value because of these negative environmental aspects. We also looked at network performance on the flip side of the coin, which is reducing journey times, reducing journey time variability for people, so they can get to work on time and they know that they can get to work, in a certain period of time, that it's not so variable anymore. That's worth a lot to the city in Manchester, around 732 million. There were also other benefits like improving access to jobs and improving access to good quality housing from this road, and that's worth a further 435 million. So again, you can start to see how all of this stacks up. You've got some negative environmental impacts, and then you've got about 1.2 billion pounds worth of positive other types of societal impacts. And again, this is being used just like with the A303 within the options assessments and also within the business case for the M60. I'll just end on, before I hand over to Louise, who will talk about this a little bit more. We have a proprietary set of tools called the Social Value Bank tools, and these are basically software tools that allow organizations to go and do the type of analysis I've just demonstrated above themselves. So in here, we have a bunch of outcomes. So we have in these tools, this is the supply chain social value bank that we developed with Morgan Sindall. We have a series of outcomes related to the supply chain. And against each outcome, we've estimated a value using these Green Book methods that I've just demonstrated above for each and every outcome. So things like mentoring, employment, CO2 emissions, etc. So you log into the software, you input data about the project and your supply chain, you then input the outcomes that you've observed, and then the tool will estimate social value for you using the Green Book methodologies. So the tool covers both the benefits to individuals, but also all of these secondary benefits. And this is a key differentiator between our tool and other tools on the market at the moment. The other tools on the market at the moment are focused entirely on what we call those secondary benefits, so these cashable benefits to the exchequer and businesses. We include that, but we also include all of the wider primary benefits, the impacts to people's quality of life, which you saw from the A303 project is absolutely vital. Without that, you're not going to get many schemes through in this country at the moment. This social value bank tool is really the only one that's fully consistent with the Green Book because we capture both features of valuation. There are quite a large number of outcomes in there, but these are the kind of the outcome areas that we cover. So employment, employability, skills and training, health and safety, lots around the environment, community engagement, and kind of giving to local communities, that type of thing, and things like local multiplier effects and supply chain events as part of procurement. So you collect data and put data around that. And this is effectively just a few screenshots on what the tool looks like. So you can put some data in about your project. You then start to work through those lists on the left-hand side there, putting in data about each element. So you put in how many people you're employing as part of it. You'd then say how many people you've got on apprenticeship schemes, your health and safety record, the environmental record, for example, and that can all be captured within this tool. The other USP about this tool is that we've got all of the values are differentiated for different regions and different types of people. So the value of a job is worth more to someone from a deprived area in Middlesbrough than it is for someone in Kent or London, for example. And that's all reflected in the values. And then the tool will give you real-time social value estimates of the projects that you're running, and you can download these types of reports from it. Having developed this with Louise's team at Morgan Sindall, they've gone on to use this in lots of different projects, and we're using this tool quite widely now with different government departments. So I'll leave it there. I think that's about half an hour, and I'm going to hand over to Louise to continue.
You don't get off the hook that quickly, Daniel. There's about 1 million questions on the chat. If I could just put you on the spot for a moment, and then we'll do the video, and then we'll hand over to Louise.
Okay.
So, first question, does the Green Book consider benefits from activities to eliminate discrimination, promote equality and fairness when engagement in society by people who may have been excluded because of who they are or which group they're in? So this is equalities and diversity question, I guess.
Yes, so it does. It will direct you back to the methods that I showed you in that green table towards the start of the presentation.
Mm-hmm.
You can again use those methods to do that. So it hasn't been very common recently in the past to look at these kind of equality issues, but there's a big drive towards that. And actually, as part of the M60 and also as part of the A465 and some stuff that we're doing within the Northern Powerhouse policy investments, we've developed a model around looking at inclusivity, whether that's based on ethnicity, income, gender, all of these different areas, health, for example. So it's an area we're starting to look at, and we're starting to incorporate that. And there's actually values that you can develop. Some of the time it's just a quantitative assessment of have you got more people from a particular background in the workforce, but you can go one step further if the data is there to actually value that, and you'll typically find that the value of doing that is higher than bringing someone in from the workforce who isn't from that kind of more disadvantaged background.
Okay, so because I think the key message that I'm taking away from this, and I've learned a lot, it's all about the impact on people. Ultimately, it boils down to the impact on individual people.
Yes.
A quick question: are you happy to share the slide deck? I'm sure lots of people are asking that.
That's fine. Yes.
You went through a lot of really interesting theory there. A couple of questions about valuing the value data about people, and there's a couple of questions with a similar sort of theme. How do you gather the value data? E.g., 10% well-being increase is worth £2,000 to an individual. Is that done by questionnaire? How do individuals ascribe an amount they would pay or be quantified for? So I think a couple of people would like a little bit more insight on that piece of it, if you could.
Yeah, so I presented today 2 different methods, and they take a very different way of doing about it. So let me just go through those in turn and just give a bit more detail. Hopefully that will clarify things. The first one I showed, which was the method that we used on the A303, was there was no data in the UK that can tell us whether preserving those stones impacts on people's quality of life. That data just doesn't exist. So in that particular circumstance, we administered a survey that we created ourselves to 5,000 people in a representative sample of 5,000 people, and we told them about the World Heritage Site at the moment, what the stones are like, the archaeological value of that site, and the effect that the road is having on the stones and people's lives. We then said, if we were to remove the road, will that impact on your quality of life? And it was an open question. It was something that people had to think about. We then said, if it does benefit your quality of life, no matter how small, would you in principle be willing to pay additional road tax or another form of taxation to implement the change, i.e. get the road removed and have the tunnel there instead? So we try and make it as realistic as possible. And some people will say, I care about it, but I don't want to pay anything. I can't afford anything. Some people will pay quite a large amount. There are a few people that are willing to pay, £200 or £300 to do that. But typically we're getting people saying, I'll pay £15 a year or something towards additional taxes. And then we get people on the other end of the spectrum who will say, I want the road as it is. I know it's intrusive, but I think it's the best option. And I don't want to pay anything for it at all. Actually, I would have to have compensation if you go ahead with it. So we're relying on people being able to digest that information and give us a reasonable value for something. So it's kind of almost setting up a scenario, like a market scenario almost, where we're telling them this change is going to happen. Do you want it? And if so, will you be willing to pay for it? And there's lots of methods that we have within the survey where we try and reduce potential behavioral issues in there. So we try and make it incentive compatible. We try and look for very extreme results and things like that. So if we get someone saying they don't care about the stones at all, but they're saying they're willing to pay £1 million, there's something very wrong there, and we'd adjust that. So there's lots of things that go on in the background, but that will give us a value per individual, and then we aggregate that. The other way, sorry, this is quite a lengthy response, but
That's okay.
the other method that we have, which is what we use on the M60, was actually sometimes there is data that correlates well-being, people's well-being, with the particular intervention we're looking at. With the M60 example, we had data on people's self-reported well-being. This is normally a question like, how satisfied are you with your life nowadays? That's one of the key OECD measures of well-being at the moment. And people will respond on a scale of 0 to 10, with 10 being a completely satisfied life. We could actually see from pollution data around the M60 that where there are higher levels of pollution or noise due to the traffic, there was a statistically significantly lower level of life satisfaction for people in those areas, controlling for everything else. So with that data, we can actually see how fluctuations in things like traffic noise, transport noise, fluctuates and how that impacts on people's well-being. And there we could say, okay, there's a 10% decrease in well-being for every 2% increase in noise, for example. So that's a different area of data. That's using government data that's already there. And it's often just a case of choosing which method is the best given the policy at hand and given the type of changes that we're talking about.
Brilliant, thank you. Yeah, very long answer to a relatively short question, but no, that's fantastic. Yeah, so what you're saying is you're trying to ask people to make an informed decision. You provide them with some facts and then ask for a view based on that. There are loads of questions on the chat. I don't know whether we're going to get through them all, but it does lead to a follow-up question, which is about leading the witness. How do you ensure impartiality? Because I guess facts, there could be one version of the facts and another version of the facts that could maybe lead people to suggesting a positive or negative response. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, so it gets very complex and also obviously very serious when we're talking about something like the A303 and the government's looking to spend 1.7 billion on it. What it means is we're able to work with a very healthy budget for these types of studies. And what we can do with that budget is when we're developing the survey instrument, we bring in a lot of experts with differing opinions. So we had archaeologists, we had historians, we had transport experts, we had environmental experts, heritage experts, all as part of that when we built the survey instrument. And what we try to do is give a balanced as an opinion as possible of the scheme and the change, and we reflect people's concerns. So this was typically the archaeologists' concerns were reflected in that, but we also reflect, the potential benefits, the environmental benefits from the environmentalists. So we have experts inputting into that survey. The survey itself took about 6 months to develop, so a huge amount of iteration, and then it then went through academic review, actually through a few universities. We were then happy that it's a neutral and balanced survey, and that went out to the population. But again, as I said, as we start collecting the data, we can start to see some anomalies in there. So there's a really funny example. We found one particular individual who was logging on with different IP addresses throughout the country because he or she knew that once they'd logged on once, they couldn't do it again. And they were very much against the scheme, so giving very high negative values, but we could track down what they were doing. So there's lots of technological barriers that we have in there as well to ensure that the information is correct, but also that we don't get one or two individuals that can completely bias and skew the thing as well.
Okay, thanks, Daniel. There's a number of questions about delivery. Whose responsibility is it to ensure that the value outputs that are at the beginning of a project are actually delivered over the life of the asset?
Yeah, so this is quite a troubling area for me, actually. And within the Green Book, they talk about appraisal and evaluation. It's very clear. The appraisal is the type of stuff I've shown you today. So upfront, what to expect that social value to be generated by a scheme. The evaluation is about then monitoring that and whether those things come to fruition 10, 20 years down the line. The government is awful, to be honest, about the evaluation bit. The budget is completely blown on the scheme itself and the appraisal stage. And I've only been involved in, I think, one policy where we've actually done monitoring afterwards. So in an ideal world, you should take the measures and metrics that you've looked at the upfront appraisal stage and continue to measure those later on and continue to value them. You should also obviously keep an eye on the cost. Was it really 1.7 billion, or did we get into 2.5 billion, for example, for the tunnel? But it's just very rarely done. But I think it's absolutely critical. And if we as private sector organizations can start to do that, I think it would be, it's absolutely critical.
Okay, couple of questions. I think what we're going to have to do is stop the questions at some point in the next few minutes. If you don't mind, would you be willing, if we sent the questions over to you, would you maybe give us a response on email to the questions?
Yeah, I'll try and do that. If it's a huge amount, I might struggle, but I'll try.
It's not hundreds. It's like it's a handful. It's a dozen or so, and I don't think we'll get through all of them in the time.
That's fine.
A couple of questions about Social Value Bank. First of all, is it free to use? I think the answer to that is no.
Yeah, so it only is if you're under a particular revenue threshold. We try and give access to small non-profits, very small, for example, organizations that are maybe doing stuff around diversity and inclusion within the supply chain, and they've got 3 employees and that type of thing. Ideally, that it should be free to use for them. But if you're under that threshold, it's basically a step approach. So it reflects the revenue of the size of the company after that.
And there's a couple of questions. Can it be used to assess the social value of an organization rather than individual projects?
Yes, in theory it can. We've just done it for one organization. So there, you wouldn't put in a project on a specific time period. You would put in data about an organization. And the one that we just looked at, they had data on the number of apprenticeship schemes they deliver in a year, how many people they employ and from what areas over a particular year, and they had their CO2 footprint. So we just inputted that and we got a value for the whole organization.
Brilliant. Okay, so that's a good positive answer. And I'm going to do one final question, and then I think we might have to deal with the others on email if you don't mind. Any additional monetisation work planned on the basis of themes and outcomes in the September 2020 Crown Commercial Services Procurement Policy Note? I know this is something that everybody's talking about at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, we are continually developing the outcomes metrics in there. We haven't specifically looked at that at the moment, but yes, we've actually got a phase 2 in process at the moment for the supply chain. So we are continually adding values there.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you very much, Daniel. I think we're going to have to stop there, otherwise we really will run out of time. But it really is a pleasure to have Daniel helping us with this, because he really is an expert on the subject. And I think the number of quite in-depth questions we've had, indicate that the people are really keen to learn about this subject. And thanks very much for explaining it in such a simple way. I'm going to change the agenda slightly, I think, given that we had so many questions for Daniel and his presentation was so good. I think I'm just going to plow on without a break, if that's okay with everybody. Do feel free to drop off and rejoin if you need to, because what we have now is, as I said earlier, a video interview, which I think you'll also find fascinating, which gives a perspective from a point of view of local authority. And Darren Nowd is the Chief Procurement Officer for Durham Council, but he also leads the Local Government Authority, Local Government Association Chief Procurement Officers Forum. So, Rosie, can we play the video, please? And let's hear that perspective. So I would like to introduce Darren Nowd, the Chief Procurement Officer of Durham County Council. And Darren has a number of other hats that he wears around social value in public procurement, which I'll ask him to explain. So, Darren, could you talk a little more about what you do and what your perspective is on delivering social value through supply chains in the public sector?
Hi, hello everybody. Darren Nowd, Chief Procurement Officer at the County Council in Durham. In addition to my day job that pays the bills, I'm also chair of the LGA National Advisory Group for Procurement, where there's 9 regional leads who come together to collaborate on all things procurement and also work with central government on policy matters. And again, within that context, I lead social value within that group. So one of my other hobbies is I am chair of the National Social Value Task Force, which is an LGA project supported by the Secretariat, which is the Social Value Portal. There's about 40 other members of various sectors who are part of that group, and we do a lot of good things about tools and techniques and approaches on social value matters.
So how do you see delivery of social value through supply chain for local government? How does it work? What works well? What works not so well for you?
I think historically, since the Social Value Act, the Public Services Social Value Act came in, a lot of councils have wrestled with trying to deliver social value outcomes, and there's different levers you can pull. And I haven't got it with me today, but I've got a slide called 4 Levers in a Bucket, which I'll share with you separately if you want to see it. It might give you a giggle. But basically, there's different routes and levers that you can pull. So, for example, one of those is the way you design the procurement process itself, in terms of its structure and how you engage with the market, with early market engagement. You may decide to put things in lots, for example, either be that technically or geographically, etc. So you can break down contracts to sizes to engage more with maybe small, medium enterprises or voluntary community sector organisations, etc. Another way, obviously, is by checking the supplier's DNA in the so-called supplier questionnaire that we use, which is standard across public sector procurement, so that you can have a look back of the market and the bidders to see whether they are the types of organisations you want to do work with, because social value is in their DNA. There's obviously another lever in terms of specifying things. So you may find, for example, by in-depth early market engagement, you may find out that actually there isn't a great deal of differential between certain things, and you might actually want to specify things. So, for example, a real example of that in the past is where we were putting in place a banking services contract for the council, about 300 schools, police and fire. And it became quite apparent that the banking industry was trying to improve its reputation with the public at large. And following the banking crash, they all had budgets to deliver training and education in schools. So we didn't include that in any evaluation criteria at all. We just specified it. You will deliver, as part of this banking services contract, 200 hours per annum going into primary schools to teach young children about money matters. And obviously the fourth lever that you can pull is related to the award criteria itself. And that's where the task force came in by the development of the so-called National Themes, Outcomes and Measures, TOMS as they're warmly known as. And that's really given us a tangible tool to explain, quantify what social value means in a lot of detail. And most importantly, because public procurement obviously has to be very open, fair and transparent and objective, it's given us ability to use the TOMS in the measurement within the award criteria that's enabled us to make decisions more effectively based on fact and quantified commitments, but also chase it down in the contract management phase by contractualising the commitments that suppliers make.
How do you see monetisation of social value, and do you see examples of misinterpretation, well-intended or otherwise, in using tools like TOMS and how assumptions are made?
I don't think there's a misinterpretation because the tool's very robust. I think the tricky issue, and this isn't just a social value thing, this is a contract management thing in terms of the fact that suppliers make commitments. Contract management activity can sometimes be variable in certain organisations. So whether all of the benefits are fully realised really is down to the attitude, endeavours and further that you pursue your contract management commitments with your supply base, be that as fundamental part of the specification what you expect, or whether the social value commitments in themselves. And one could argue if you're poor at contract management, not only will your contract not perform, then the benefits that suppliers have committed in social value will also not be realised. So it's really important to pursue that, hence my 4 levers and a bucket. The bucket is make sure you chase the bits down into the bucket, otherwise why bother trying to get commitments and contractualise them in the first place. I think there's a reality been experienced during the COVID period where suppliers most genuinely made commitments on social value for contracts that quite legitimately could not be delivered. So if you, for example, that banking services contract, for example, is probably a good example. If a commitment is made to go into primary schools to teach children money matters, and the government won't let you go into primary schools to teach kids money matters, what do you do?
Or if the schools are closed.
Yeah. So you have to be flexible and creative about alternative opportunities, such as events like this. So, and again, but I think that's down to relationship management. I think that's down to good contract management. Being candid, I think if a supplier ever overcommitted deliberately with no intention to perform, I think if you've got strong contract management in place, you can deal with that and you can contractualize things. And certain councils now are putting in, the equivalent of, say, liquidated damages.
Yeah.
So you committed X, which has a value of Y, and you haven't delivered that value. So we need to talk about the financial implications of that. Quite frankly, if you ever end up in that kind of conversation, the relationship is not going well and things, don't augur well. I've not been there myself. I don't know anybody who has, but I guess as ever, as social value increases in its profile, in its impact, and people are pursuing it, there's always going to be a supplier who doesn't perform and promises the earth and doesn't deliver. And I think that's where procurers have to be firm and tackle those issues, because being candid, I can see a time in a very competitive marketplace where maybe the quality of suppliers is quite similar, where the cost proposals are quite similar, where social value is increasing in its weighting and its importance and priority, where social value could be the tipping point between win and lose. And therefore, it's only right and proper that suppliers deliver and suppliers are held account if they don't deliver, to make sure that we deliver the outcomes that we pursue.
When you talk about weightings, what sort of weighting factors are you seeing being placed on social value these days in percentage terms?
Really varies. I think the important thing about social value is it's a journey, and you need to walk before you can run. And a lot of people go small, quite rightly, just to test the process, to learn how to maximize the opportunities. There's no science in my view, but I have a strong view that anything less than 10% kind of signals to the market you're not really serious.
Yeah.
Any more than 20% kind of starts to signal out that you might be prepared to pay for it. So, between me, my gut feel, hunch, professional experience in the last 2-3 years of this social value journey, regionally in the Northeast through the Northeast Procurement Organisation, locally in Durham, and debates with colleagues, is less than 10, don't bother, more than 20, be careful. But again, every project has its own opportunity areas. As a rough guide, in Durham, we're mandating a minimum of 10 from January. And bear in mind, we've been doing this for 3 years and are quite experienced about it. So we've never really gone less than 10, but we're now being quite assertive, with the service managers saying we're not going any less than 10, and we're looking to explore more opportunities. And different projects deliver different outcomes. If you wanted a ballpark figure, I would say it's quite reasonable to expect a 25% additionality return with the social value that you pursue. Some contracts are more than others. We've got, particularly in the construction field, being candid, with the opportunity for local supply chains, local employment, apprenticeships, spending local with SMEs and VCSEs. We've seen 35-40% in some cases, and others have more. Whereas maybe in an ICT contract on a technical system, the percentage outcome will be less. So there's the consideration about the weighting in the procurement decision, and then there's what you can actually achieve as percentage additionality as an outcome.
Where do you see you talked about writing it in the spec and saying thou shalt, and then on the other hand putting out a fairly open spec that says, how will you deliver social value? Writing it in the spec obviously is a very clean way of doing it, because you're very clear about what you want and what you expect, but that stifles innovation. Where do you see the balance between those two techniques being employed? And also, if you go down the more open route of saying to your supply chain, how are you going to deliver social value? Do your supply chain really understand it? Are they competent to come up with those answers and those solutions for you?
That's two questions.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the specification bit, people's view varies. Okay. And if I guess if you talk to some of the social value academics and purists, they say have it all open. My view's a little bit different, but it depends on how much research you've done and, you know, the market information you have. So using the example of the banking, from the market engagement, it became very apparent in the debates about the art of the possible. All of the banks were prepared to commit a couple of 100 hours to go into schools to teach children money matters. It seemed to be very common as an approach. They had a budget for it. They thought it was relevant, proportionate and reasonable. So we took a choice there and we thought, well, rather than waste percentage points in an evaluation assessment on that one issue, we'll just specify it and we'll use the points elsewhere with an open approach. So, you know, outcome-based procurement is always the best from experience. We happen to use the LGA National TOMS, which is very open and it gives the opportunity for innovation and people to bid, because from experience, you can never do enough early market pre-procurement engagement. Even when you do a lot, you never know everything. You know, you don't know what you don't know. So having that outcome-based approach for me is always the best. But what's the point in wasting certain percentage point in the scoring mechanism? If you know they're all going to turn up with 200 hours of teaching children money matters in school, you may as well specify it, so long as you're confident that the market can, you know, can do it. And again, going back to your supplier understanding, it's really important, you know, whether we're talking about social value and comms measurements or procurement in general, that you articulate what it is you're looking to achieve as outcomes, and the market reciprocates with its response to you about what it's prepared to deliver, could deliver. So the pre-procurement engagement must include a conversation about the contract itself, the outcome you would seek to deliver, including the social value expectations and the social value possibilities. Because at the end of the day, this ends up all being wrapped up in a contract with a series of KPIs, and the social value KPIs are just one part of a raft of KPIs that you would expect to be delivered in the contract. And lo and behold, no early market engagement, no conversation with the supplier can lead to poor outcomes, believe it or not. So the more you talk, the earlier you talk, the best chance you've got of delivering a better outcome. It's not really rocket science, it's kind of common sense. But nevertheless, I'm sure, as I've experienced, and I'm sure many colleagues in the room have experienced, it doesn't always work out that way. Sometimes you've got to move faster than you would like. You have a less than optimum time to plan and prepare and engage, and that leads to less than optimum outcomes. But sometimes, you know, particularly, for example, in my world, where grant funding opportunities come at very short notice, you've got to bid fast for them, you get the money quickly, you've got to dispose of the money and deliver your outcomes in a very tight time scale. It's better than not having the money and not doing it. But if we'd had more planning time, we could have done a better job.
Brilliant. Final question then. Where do you see social value in procurement in the future? Say in 5 years' time, ideally, what would you like to see?
Well, from my perspective, it's social value is quite fundamental, but I'm a local government procurement person. So a council's job is to deliver social, economic and environmental outcomes. That's why we exist. So if I'm not considering social value when I'm using my procurement spend, and I can't evidence how that's achieving the corporate objectives, it isn't a strategic procurement matter. I'm just buying stuff. So I think for me, it will increase in focus in local government. I think also, and this is something I'm exploring locally in the Northeast and in County Durham particularly, is what I refer to as place-based procurement. Social value is very high in profile in local government, but one could argue maybe in certain other public sector partners, be that health, be that education, be that police, be that fire, be that other maybe local anchor institutions that are in your locality, or even the church, who've got a lot of land actually to do good things on. Whether they see it as the same priority as I do is debatable, and that's something I'm trying to pursue. So I'm trying to set up networks with all the other Darrens in the locality in County Durham to pursue that. And I think COVID has the opportunity is very ripe at the moment. COVID has encouraged people to collaborate out of necessity, maybe people who have not collaborated before, and actually a lot of good things have been delivered. So relationships have changed for the better, and I think that augurs well for social value. The other thing I would say is, without telling tales out of school, obviously, I work very closely with Cabinet Office and with MHCLG on the policy front. And we've worked better than ever before to talk to each other about opportunities. And I am confident that in the very near future, we will see strong government policy direction and new rules for procurement that will be very different than we've seen before, that will give us an opportunity to be far more innovative than before and will be far less complex to deal with. I can't explain what that means at the minute because nothing is decided, but what I can say is Cabinet Office particularly are very in tune with the social value agenda, and they themselves, of course, have only recently just issued PPN 0620, whereby social value will be mandatory in local government procurements above a certain value with a minimum of 10% weighting. So I think more and more getting better value for the public pound will be a priority, and social value will be critical.
Very clear message. Thank you very much indeed. That's been an interesting session. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Cheers. Thank you.
Okay, thanks everybody. I hope you enjoyed that video. Some very clear messages in there, particularly about the direction the public procurement is taking, and also potentially how the procurement rules might work post-Brexit. Darren did actually share a few more insights off camera that we're not allowed to talk about at this point, but I think his general guidance around the focus on social value and also the simplifying of the procurement rules when we leave the EU is a very powerful one. So I'm going to hand over to Louise now to talk to us about what's it like on the ground. How do you deliver all of this stuff, Louise?
Good morning, everyone. I hope you're all well. I'm not going to take very long at all. Really, the agenda for me is to talk about how confidence is growing in the delivery and reporting of social value. And that's really around the increased opportunity that there is to collaborate across corporate borders that might not have been there previously. When I think back to 10 years ago, Morgan Sindall consciously dipped its toe in the social value waters by the procurement of a license to LM3. We didn't probably realise at the time that that was social value, but it felt like something that was useful to help us manage our supply chain better locally. Then I'm going to just give you a little bit of oversight and insight into how we deliver social value at Morgan Sindall, and then just a little bit about monetisation in the context of the construction industry. So there's been quite a lot of talk about this already this morning. In September 2020, Crown Commercial Services put out a procurement note around the improved or more focused measurement of social value. And the key themes around that procurement note were response to COVID-19, in supporting the reduction in inequality and supporting climate emergency across the UK. As part of that procurement note, there was a minimum 10% weighting. And already we're sort of seeing some governmental campaigns and projects and sort of changes or enhanced focus on things like climate change. There's the Kickstart programme, which government announced recently, that is designed to support young people into sustainable careers, that kind of stuff. There's also some green shoots of validated onshore offset mechanisms that previously haven't really been available to the construction industry. So all in all, it's a way more confident voice than it was 10 years ago. 10 years ago, people were saying, what is this strange social value thing? And now people are saying, oh, we understand this in the context of the service that is being procured from us, and we know how to do it. So that's great. So how does Morgan Sindall deliver social value? It's a fairly simple and straightforward 4-step process, really. It's not, but it is. For us, social value is about collaboration in procurement, and our whole strategy is really designed around that. So when on a project delivery, we have something that we call the social value charter that maps to the outputs of the social value bank, and we design that social value charter with the client so that we know that we're delivering the social value to their own requirements and the requirements of that community, rather than just saying this is a one size fits all. We did quite a lot of work to our design management standard about 3 years ago, and there's now a significant number of social value signposts within that design management standard that helps us to embed social value requirements and potential outcomes into the design of the buildings that we're delivering. Once we've done that, we have something then that we've called the responsible procurement framework, and this embeds those social value requirements into our subcontract procurement activity. This was kind of designed on the basis that all tier one contractors, not just Morgan Sindall, but we are directly responsible for delivering between 10 and 20% of everything that we deliver for the client, and the rest of that is delivered by our supply chain. So if we're making those promises to our customers, then we are duty bound, and it's morally right that we share those promises with our supply chain. If we don't tell them what we've promised to deliver, then how can they possibly help us to succeed? And the final part of the process is the monetisation reporting of the social value outcomes against that original social value charter, so that we can benchmark our own performance against what we originally promised. So why did we elect for the social value bank? Well, Daniel will probably tell me off because I'll get all the words wrong, but I'm going to go for it anyway. So we really loved the fact that the social value bank measured the outcomes of what we do rather than the input value of what we do. I think Daniel's probably talked quite a lot about that previously, so I won't embarrass myself or anybody else anymore by trying to explain that. But for us, it was really important that we were measuring and reporting the outcomes of our inputs rather than just putting a financial value to, or a monetary value to, our inputs. It measures more things in a different way. So we're currently measuring well in excess of 80 metrics that are all interrelated and deliver an enhanced output for us. As far as the tool is concerned, it's online. So we've got real-time access at any point. I could press a button now and report to whoever the monetized social value of everything that we're delivering, and within which metrics that monetization is happening. So it enables us to see where business units are performing really well, which enables us then to look at things like the strategies that we're putting in place to deliver things like apprenticeships and supply chain diversity, that kind of stuff. So it's helping us to identify where performance is creating a greater impact. What was really important to us is that we didn't overclaim anything. I think one of the things that was just really important that we're not overclaiming, and I think through the work that Symmetrica did for us, it's achieved that. It takes account of things like it, so it includes the counterfactual and takes account of disbenefit and opportunity cost as well. So it's not just, it's a rich result rather than being something that's two-dimensional and wouldn't necessarily stand up to scrutiny. What was really important for us, because we're national, is that we could reflect better to the locality where we're reporting to. So the fact that the social value bank is geographically sensitive is really useful and very helpful. And oversimplistically, that means basically that the value of an apprenticeship in one part of the country will be, or could potentially be, very different to that same apprenticeship in a different part of the country. And I guess the most important reason why the social value bank is because it aligns to the Green Book, as Daniel's already described. It uses the same valuation methodology, and it identifies the key stakeholders for social value as defined, I think, in the Green Book, of the environment, individuals, businesses and government. And it puts a value to the relation, the sort of the interdependency of those four stakeholder groups. So if we're creating a value for an individual, then there will be an additional benefit to some of those other stakeholders too. So that's why we chose the social value bank. On the screen, you can see an example of the same project that we ran through two different tools. And I think in the context of the construction industry, as Daniel's already said, we selected the social value bank because it's driven by the same methodology, valuation methodology as HM Treasury Green Book. And for us in Morgan Sindall, the value of monetisation to our customers is really that it is to build on the capital investment. So that monetisation process and the output from that needs to be as closely aligned as it possibly can be to the valuation methodology that is applied at the capital investment business case point. So I don't know whether you can see the values on the screen very well, but the social value bank output is the document on the left, and the document on the right is from one of the other tools that's commonly used in the market. And I think because of the way that the valuation methodology works, it's just demonstrating really that as far as the social value bank is concerned, it's approximately double in terms of monetisation to the alternative tools. So, and I think that's probably it from me. If anybody's got any questions, I'll be pleased to take any. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Louise. Yeah, I mean, there's a question here that I was about to ask. How do we create a level playing field that social value of one project delivered by X contractor can be related to another delivered by Y contractor, when you've just showed us this massive difference in use of the various evaluation tools? How can some poor buyer in the public sector, or indeed in the private sector, understand this?
For me, there's a fairly simple explanation, which goes back to my part of the presentation. Sorry, I just jumped in there, but it's just on
Yeah,
the
thanks,
technical
Daniel.
side. It's that with things like Tom's framework, they are only focusing on the secondary benefits. So if you remember, those benefits to the exchequer and businesses, which misses out, as you've seen on Louise's example, at least half of the value. And so what we're capturing is the value to individuals' quality of life of having employment or going through an apprenticeship scheme or having lower CO2 emissions, all of these additional things. And most of the time that's far greater than these secondary benefits. So it's quite an easy explanation, actually, just that ours covers more because it's fully aligned with the Green Book, which asks you to cover all of these elements. So I think where we need to get to is for the sector to understand that the Green Book exists, which is actually a bit hit and miss at the moment. Most of them don't, and to use a tool that aligns with that fully, and then we should have this consistent comparison across everyone.
Okay, thanks, Daniel. I mean, obviously, we need to say here that you have a tool, and National Toms is another tool, and effectively a competitor that Darren was mentioning. So there's another question here. Lots of councils are using National Toms framework. Does this tool work with this? Daniel, if I could maybe ask you to give a perspective, and then Louise, if you could maybe give us some thoughts on, we seem to have a sort of Betamax versus VHS debate going on here.
Our tool covers, I think, most of the Tom's outcomes. Just actually does that because they're key part of the supply chain. But it does more basically. So the Toms will give you these secondary values. So what are the cost savings to the government? What are the monetized benefits to businesses, etc.? If you want to go beyond that and have the full picture of social value, that's where our tool comes in, basically. But it does both. So we do cover the business benefits, but we also have the individual, the wider benefits to people's quality of life. So you'd get in a bit of a mess if you tried to use the two together. You'd get into a lot of double pricing because we already incorporate the values in there.
And then a question for Louise, I guess. Are you running these tools across all your projects? Do you regularly report on the different social value metrics internally to measure your own performance as an organisation? How does that work for you, Louise?
Yeah, from a user's perspective, as far as the Toms and the social value bank are concerned, they align very well with each other. And, Morgan Sindall is working with an awful lot of local authorities that are applying the Toms, and it's rarely, if ever, a problem for us. And, that was sort of designed in from the outset, really, because the Toms were in existence or in sort of quite late stage development at the point when the social value bank was being developed. So that was done with purpose. So that's my view on that. As far as the question that can you remind me what the question was?
Do you run these tools on all of your projects?
Yes, we do.
Everything right the way across the board.
Yeah. Well, probably 90% of our projects now go through the social value bank. Yes. And as far as the social value within our own organisation is concerned, we do use it in that way. There are elements of social value that the organisation creates that currently aren't measured within the social value bank. But in the context of the construction industry's value to society, it's really about our service offering. So, we're quite comfortable with that.
Okay, thank you. There's a question here that I'm not sure we can answer, but can you give any guidance on the cost to use of the tools to measure social value? Where can we find a list of options and tools to measure alongside Symmetrica? As far as I'm aware, I don't think a sort of an independent evaluation of the various tools on the market exists. I don't know, Louise or Daniel, if you can expand on that.
We've got our own prices and tiered structure that we can send, but we don't really know the ins and outs of the other tools. It'd be hard to do.
Of course, yeah. Okay, so that's. But Louise, can you enlighten us on that?
No, I mean, the only comment that I would make, I suppose, is that where customers advocate or mandate a tool that's alternative to the social value bank, then typically they would fund that.
Right. Yeah. Okay, so from your
so
perspective, Social Value Bank is what you use as standard.
yes,
And then if a customer asks you to use something different, you would ask for the customer to pay for that.
they normally have that as part of their, as part of their
Part of what
framework
they do,
agreement or
yeah.
whatever. So,
Okay.
they would normally have that kind of arrangement with the social value portal. So
Yeah.
it would be free at the point of delivery for us.
Okay, yeah, thank you. No, that's great. If I can go back to, I mean, these are really probably questions for both of you, but back to some of the questions that were asked during Daniel's presentation. There was a question about the cost of borrowing for projects. So, Daniel, you were talking about, a 1.7 billion road scheme. Clearly, there's an additional cost of government borrowing on top of that. Is that something that's taken into account in these conversations and this evaluation?
Yeah, so that 1.7 billion is, as far as we can possibly do, it represents what's called the opportunity cost of doing something. So what we do there is we don't just reflect on what the build materials and the labour materials to build the tunnel in that example. We're thinking about what could have been used with that money instead, or the materials instead, and what borrowing will be one element of that. If we're having to borrow, that's an additional opportunity cost. So we didn't do a huge amount on the cost side. That was coming from DFT and Treasury, but they should have incorporated that. If they've used the Green Book to the letter, they should incorporate all of those types of issues, yeah.
So the budget that comes from Highways England, the total budget, would include the cost of borrowing, and then you take that number and look at the relative social value. Louise, can I ask you a question, which is sort of alludes to what was asked by Daniel on the chat? This issue of what I call let and forget, and also the video from Darren kind of covered the same thing as well. In many cases, procuring organisations will let a contract and then don't necessarily follow up as diligently as they maybe could or should to ensure that some of these more complex outcomes are delivered. And you said in your presentation that effectively 80+% of the work that you do goes to your supply chain. How do you manage that supply chain to deliver what you asked for in the first place?
It's part of their performance review.
Okay.
It's as simple as that, really. So if we've committed to a number of outputs and the supply chain partner is part of that delivery, then it becomes part of their performance review.
And is that reviewed during the course of the contract, or is it something that's so you're reviewing the supplier's performance in real time, effectively?
Yeah. So for Morgan Tyndall, we have a performance management process. It's not really that, but for the purposes of social value delivery management, it is. We use something called perfect delivery, and social value is embedded in that ongoing review of the overall project performance. So it's quite easy to see because we're monitoring it all the time. It's quite easy to see where people might be under delivering.
Yeah. There's another question now about housing. Do housing developers and councils go through the same process when implementing new schemes in villages, etc.? I don't know whether either of you can answer that from a housing perspective.
Well, my view is that would be through planning law. That would be delivered through planning law rather than through direct procurement activity. So it's not part of the procurement package. It's part of the procurement Section 106 type of obligation.
And Louise, you mentioned earlier LM3. Could you just expand a little on that? And is that just something that you used to do, and now you're using Social Value Bank? Where does LM3 fit into this? And can you explain a little more what it is to the audience?
Sorry. So LM3 is a tool that we apply to our supply chain procurement activity to measure the local economic impact, and that it's done by asking the supply chain partners to report back to us what percentage of their spend is within a certain radius and what percentage is outside that radius. And that creates a return on investment for every pound that we spend with supply chain. So it's an incredibly easy tool to use, and it's helped us massively with increasing our local supply chain. The other module that we have within it, that I don't know whether it's part of the standard module that you can buy online, it enables us to predict the diversity of our workforce and the diversity of the ownership of our supply chain. So it's an incredibly useful tool that actually is one of the metrics that is then included in the social value bank.
Right. Okay, so this is something that you use in addition to, and it helps you to measure one aspect of social value.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. There's another question here, I guess, for either of you. Do you include the benefits risk calculation, the construction supply chains, for example, the benefits of employing local labour? How does that work in terms of thinking through the benefits?
So in the tool, there's some differentiation about where the project is currently being delivered. So
Mhm.
and that impacts on it. And then you tell it certain factors. If you know about the person being employed, for example, on gender, you can say they're ex-armed forces, for example, or an ex-offender, age.
Mhm.
So it differentiates along those lines. So there is some differentiation to a certain degree, but it is not, pinpoint accuracy, but it gives you a better picture than just taking the averages.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Louise, do you have a view on that?
Well, only in as much as that's really what LM3 does.
Mm.
LM3, because it's asking where the money is spent, that includes the local labour element of our supply chain packages as well as the materials delivery.
And this is a supplementary question from me. How do you define local and the nuance behind that? As some of the audience will know, I used to chair something called the Commission for a Sustainable London 2012, which was the oversight body for sustainability of the London Olympics. And there was a huge amount of controversy about how you define particularly local labour. And, there were lots of stories in the Daily Mail about plane loads of people coming over from Eastern Europe, and then they rent a house in Newham, and suddenly they're a Cockney, and they're considered local because they've got a local postcode. How do you define local? And I've also seen issues where organisations are trying to claim social value because the head office of an organisation is in Manchester, but the work is being carried out in London. And if an apprentice lives in Leeds but works in London, where do you count that social value? There's a whole range of nuances around defining local.
Daniel, do you want to go, or do you want me to? I mean, I have a view.
Go on, Louise.
Well, I'm going to refer back to LM3 again, because I think that the purpose of defining locality is so that you can start to measure the economic impact of activity, and regardless of where that individual, if we're talking about the Eastern European that's living in Hackney, if you're paying him £100 a week, he will probably be spending £90 of that £100 in Hackney. So the local economic impact is sustained regardless of where he originated from. I appreciate that there is some nuance to it, and I think it can become quite mischievous, where you're talking about one borough compared to another, and where those apprentices have come from, and all of that kind of stuff can actually be quite divisive for the individuals concerned. And if you're talking about an organisation like Highways England, for example, well, their locality is the whole of England, because that's their purpose, is to improve the well-being of the English population. So it's very nuanced.
Daniel, do you have a view on this?
Yeah, I mean, it's really for the user to define them. I mean, we can guide them. There are issues that our main concern is around double counting and that type of thing, and displacement. So for organisations to think around whether that's actually an additional job or you've just taken that from another region, and hence they've a negative aspect, and we talk about that in the guidance around the social value bank. But it is up to really the data inputter, as it were, to think through those issues and to think through that kind of locality issue themselves when they put the data in, and take that once they've got the results out.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it was a slightly mischievous question because I know there are kind of no right or wrong answers. And certainly on the Olympics, I would take the same view as Louise expressed. If people are contributing to the economy of the region, then does it matter whether they're migrant workers or not? But the sort of political backlash that I had from that, of course, the whole purpose of building the London Olympics in East London was to regenerate the community in areas where there was intergenerational unemployment, a lot of social deprivation. So somebody coming in from Eastern Europe and renting a place in Newham or Hackney was a contribution to the economy of that region, but not necessarily to the people who may have had access to those jobs. But there was an awful lot of work to upskill people and to take people out of unemployment as well. And I guess, Daniel, from point of view, the way that you would measure the social value of taking a previous long-term unemployed person into the workplace would generate quite significant social value. Is that correct?
Yeah, it just depends on that individual's characteristics, kind of background characteristics, and whether you have that information. You can just alternatively put in, you've got one additional person into employment and it will take the average value, but it's nuanced to a certain degree, yes.
Yeah. A couple of other questions appearing on the chat. This is one specifically for Daniel. How do you manage those non-financial benefits that don't have guidance within the Green Book? How do you look to capture data within it when there is no industry standard?
So the Green Book doesn't mandate anything in particular for a particular type of benefit outcome. It mandates a methodology or a series of methodologies, around 5 or 6 different methodologies, which in theory any of them could be applied to measure any value. Once you've become fairly expert or fairly kind of au fait with the different methods, you'll be able to see that certain ones are better than others. So in theory, whether it's diversity and inclusion, environment, biodiversity, crime, nuclear, decommissioning, whatever the issue is, methods in the Green Book have been applied before and they should be applicable. So it's just a case of acknowledging those methods to a certain, enough that you can apply them in different circumstances.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Daniel. So there's lots of questions appearing on the chat. Does Morgan Sindall or similar main contractors report back down their supply chain some of the social value a project has achieved by supplier? For lower tier suppliers, it's difficult to quantify individual contribution to a project level social value and therefore realise and report that contribution. That's quite a mouthful, Louise. Are you able to respond to that?
I'm gonna need to read that question again. Sorry.
Okay, yeah. Okay, should I read it out again?
Yeah, apologies.
Okay, no problem. So does Morgan Sindall or similar main contractors report back down their supply chain some of the social value a project has achieved by supplier? For lower tier suppliers, it's difficult to quantify individual contributions to project level social value.
Right. Okay.
And therefore realise and report. So do you acknowledge,
Yeah.
do you have a way of acknowledging a
So
supplier's
yes and no.
Okay.
So part of LM3 provides the contributor to the LM3 project with a certificate to say what contribution they've made from an economic growth or economic activity viewpoint. As far as the the more general social value reporting, no, we don't do that at the moment, but it is something that we're looking at because it's a contribution that they've made. I mean, implicitly we do, because it's part of our performance, it's part of our performance reviewing of supply chain partners.
Okay.
So implicitly we do, but they don't get a certificate or they don't get a you've created this much social value type stuff. So I would say yes, but could try harder, probably.
Okay. Thank you. And I guess there's a couple of comments there on the issue of local. And Liz Holford, hi Liz. The issue of local is not typically about a place of origin of the person, but their place of permanent residence. On London 2012, some people were being counted as local when they just rented a room in the local borough for a few nights a week. And I would certainly concur with that. That's, that definitely happened. And then from Kevin Bosher, except the situation be local or not can lead to mistrust in any social value calculation by those who may be disadvantaged. And I think this is this issue of if you're counting effectively migrant labour as local, I don't know whether that's something you can monetize or value, but the issue of trust within local communities is very important. I don't know if either of you have got any thoughts on that one.
We've looked at trust before. It's not in the supply chain tool, but we did some work for the Cabinet Office around big society and that type of thing. I think that's the terminology they used back then. But within that, we looked at things like community trust, social capital, those types of things. And yes, we have published values around that. We don't have anything specifically back to your point around kind of migrant labour and that type of thing, and any trust issues there. But we've looked. There is a positive value for having obviously trust in the local community per se.
Sure, and I would say, sort of from a Morgan Sindall viewpoint, it would be very rare for us to go shouting from the rooftops about the monetized social value that we've created associated with any of our activities, because it's intangible and largely irrelevant to individuals within society, and could almost be seen to be designed to create mistrust, because where is that money?
Yes, yeah. So it's something. I mean, I think we've all gleaned from from Daniel's presentation and yours, Liz, and hearing from Daniel that this is a complex issue. I mean, Daniel did a beautiful job of explaining it in terms that we can understand. But the other issue from your presentation, Liz, is that these, Louise, sorry, this is nuanced. It's, each project, each region, each area will have a different definition of social value. There isn't a nice 6x6 matrix that you can tick and say, I've delivered social value because I've delivered these boxes. It actually requires thought and effort and understanding of the communities in which you operate.
Yeah. Shaun, I'm just going to put my email address in the
yes, please do.
the box, because I'm conscious we're running out of time, and if anybody wants to pick up any of the questions separately with me,
brilliant.
I'll be happy to do that.
Yeah, if we don't mind, one more question for you, Louise, and then I'm going to close. Do you benchmark your suppliers on their social value contribution and weight your own tenders according to these metrics?
Yes.
So you do this supplier appraisal, and that feeds into.
So we have within our supply chain process, we have sort of performance metrics, and those are assessed kind of annually, biannually, through 360-degree reviews, stuff like that.
Yeah.
But the responsible procurement framework that I alluded to in the presentation does exactly that. It basically heat maps the risk and opportunity within the supply chain partner's ability to deliver. So, if we're delivering 3 million cube of concrete, then we're probably not going to ask that supply chain partner to deliver apprentices. We'll ask them to reduce their carbon and water and traffic management and air quality instead. So yes, absolutely, we do that.
So it's very much prioritised by sector.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we're really going to have to wrap there. That was an absolutely brilliant conversation, and thanks very much to the two speakers, and thanks to Darren for his contribution by video. It's clearly a popular subject. I think at peak we had close to 150 people on the call, and that's a very key message for us in the supply chain school, that this is a subject of interest to our members and to our partners. So we'll certainly be following up, and you're getting lots of thanks and compliments on the chat box. So thanks very much to our three speakers, 2 live and 1 recorded, and thanks to all of you in the virtual audience for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much.